All right, is that working?
Yes, it works perfectly.
You should just see a slide, correct?
Yeah, that's a head slide, yeah.
Thank you. I think it's good afternoon still for everybody, but good afternoon, evening, morning if necessary. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this and presenting today. And as Olga said, I'll be taking the science. So we've heard a lot of science presentations and some things from the European Space Agency. This is us looking at the science and more looking at it from a policy lens and how these two interact and what the relevance of science for policy is. So I'm the head of the science program at UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center. Sorry, I'm just trying to advance the slides and they're not cooperating at all. This is the same problem that Anna Maria, there we are. Are you now on the second slide? Okay, excellent. So as I was saying, I'm the head of the science program at UNEP WCMC, or United Nations Environment Program World Conservation Monitoring Center, which is, it's basically we look at global biodiversity. We work together with UN Environment Program, but we're a sort of self-functioning NGO as well. And we really work at the interface of science and policy and practice. I think that's what distinguishes us and sets us apart. So the only thing we don't do is collect raw data from the field, but everything else from there on up. So looking at data, working with data, improving data, analyzing data, modeling data, feeding that, and I guess most critically, feeding that data and feeding those analyses into policy. And that might be local policy or national policy, regional or global. So we provide, I guess, technical expertise and scientific input, strategy, and then project support to try and basically increase capacity and inspire decision makers around the world to better manage biodiversity and ecosystem services. And I think hopefully that helps explain a little bit about who we are and what we try to do. So as said, what is the interaction between remote sensing and policy? Why does any of this matter? Is remote sensing interesting? It obviously is to you, it is to scientists. Absolutely, but what about to policymakers? And I think this is a really critical question. It has to be interesting to them, or it's our responsibility to make it interesting to them and for them to realize why remote sensing matters and why it's important. So what about the other way around? Is policy interesting? It should be. It isn't always I can see Gareth is enjoying my cartoons. It isn't always seemingly to scientists or to us. And I can say certainly when I was younger and studying, I didn't really understand the relevance of policy directly, but it is really, really important, and science can inform it. And it's also a two-way street because policy also informs science and supports science. So this is why it's really important to think about all of this. So unfortunately, no, the government can't just fix, 4 degrees of warming or the permafrost melting or all the things that we've heard over the last 2 days that are going on in the Arctic. But there are very serious policy things to consider. So for example, in 1992, the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development was adopted. And this, in Principle 10, it sets out 3 fundamental rights, which is the access to information, or the access to public participation, and access to justice as pillars of sound environmental governments. So you might wonder, well, why does this really matter? But these rights have emerged to be really important in promoting transparent, inclusive, and accountable environmental governments. And 25 years later or more, technology, and specifically in this case, remote sensing, has really transformed our ability to exercise these access rights. And the potential to use a whole range of remote sensing data for global environmental monitoring and governance is unprecedented. I don't think anyone sitting in Rio 25 years ago would have imagined just how much it's transformed. And even I'm amazed compared to when I did my PhD with Gareth 15 or so years ago, the difference that exists now. So we are really in a remarkable phase where there is a lot of potential to contribute. Something important, data alone are not sufficient, or access to data, so that's not enough. We really need a robust analytical approach to transform that data into information and into knowledge. And then beyond that, that needs to be translated for policy use into insights and indicators. And this is why remote sensing is relevant, because remote sensing allows the data, the analysis, the knowledge, and the indicators to all be developed to inform policy. And whether that policy is national, even local, working with Indigenous peoples or Indigenous areas, or whether it's regional or global, it all matters. And so scientific knowledge, and in this case, we're talking about remote sensing data, can influence decisions, change outcomes, and achieve positive impacts on the ground, which is what we're aiming for. So while we can't magically stop climate change, we can work to improve things. And so why does policy matter to the Arctic? I think we all understand that really clearly. We understand the changes in the Arctic. That's what we've heard about the last couple of days. You know, the 4 degrees warming or so in different regions, the changing winter temperatures, the methane release, the permafrost melting, the melting lakes and snow, all the impacts on vegetation, on wildlife, on livelihoods, and on the whole kind of gigantic shift. So policy is really important, and the policy response. And as we know, and as has been said, the Arctic doesn't exist alone. The Arctic impacts the rest of the world, just as the rest of the world impacts the Arctic. And so this is why policy really matters. So what can improve policy? Policy is not, doesn't always work. I think it is improving. Globally, the environmental policies are improving, but how can we contribute to that as scientists? So as I've said, this is through data, through science, through analysis, and then remote sensing can really help that. So we often talk about, in the biodiversity world, state, pressure, and response. These aren't quite in the right order, but the second one along from the left is the state. So what's the state of the environment, the state of biodiversity? So how are things? And so in this case, generally the outcomes are that things are worsening. What about the pressures? As you can see on the very left in the pressure graph, pressures tend to be worsening. And what do I mean by pressures? That could be things like climate change. It can be things like resource development, pressure on resource use, like water use, deforestation, all these sorts of impacts. In the third one along, benefits. What do I mean by benefits? And that tends to be phrased as ecosystem services or nature's contributions to people. So that is the benefits that we get from nature. So we've heard about some of them already in the last talks, about carbon stocks, about biomass, about things about like water systems, forests, clean air. All these sorts of functions of nature are the benefits. And those too are what we get from nature is also decreasing. So this was research that was done, again, with the policy impact. So there's something called the Aichi targets, which are global biodiversity targets that were established about 10 years ago, for 10 years. And this was in sort of a midterm review to look at the progress towards them. So while this was all quite negative, looking at the pressure in the state and things, I want to focus your attention on the green chart in the right, which is the response. So this is kind of the good news. Is that responses to these situations are improving. And this is where data and analysis and science and indicators come in. And this is where science informing policy is really important, because it allows the response to the environment to improve and to be bettered. So that was the point of that. Now looking at, this conference is about vegetation in the Arctic. So when you consider data, there's all sorts of things to think about. There's vegetation on the species level. Then there's ecosystems, which is basically the overall biotic and abiotic environment in which the species, like vegetation, live and interact. And then there's biodiversity, which is the variety and amount of both living organisms, which includes genetic composition, taxonomic identity, and functional traits. So it includes those organisms and the ecosystems in which they live. And I think Alexander made this connection yesterday when he was talking about climate change. And we need to consider biodiversity. So looking at all levels, all the way from species to ecosystems to biodiversity and all of the interactions. And this is where the previous slide about the state, the pressure, and the response sort of matters. We need to be considering how these systems, how biodiversity is responding to the state and to the pressure of things, and understanding those responses so that we can act and make better decisions is what really matters. And that's why policy is relevant. I'm just checking, I can see something in the chat and I want to make sure that it's not a warning of any sort, so just give me a moment. Okay, sorry, that was an old one. All right, back to where I am. So looking at policy, everyone I think has certainly heard of the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has been around for a while. So this is one of the, I think, the most clear examples where global policy can really impact science, and this is where it sort of goes hand in hand, that with these IPCC reports that are increasingly, people are increasingly aware of, science informs them, and that's a really nice example. The next thing that comes is, sorry, there we are, is IPBES, which is basically the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services equivalent of the IPCC. So IPBES is the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services instead of climate change. And again, this is this global effort to look at science, to look at analysis, and use that to better inform policy and better make change. So their main report came out last year, and all these efforts are sort of ongoing. So now that's sort of the background. Now I'll switch to giving a series of examples from the work at UNEP-WCMC of how remote sensing data matters to policy and how it can impact policy and how the two are connected. So the first one I'll mention is nature's contributions to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So I suspect you've all heard of the SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals. And so, what are they? This is this global effort to put goals on things, to make targets achievable. And within those targets are indicators. So you can measure, are we progressing towards this target or not? So for example, SDG 15 is to protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, to sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. So within the SDGs, there's 17 of them. This is just a graph or a chart depicting them as sort of a series of donuts. And I think what's important to note is there's three main categories. So there's the economy, society, and then biosphere, or the natural world. And essentially the biosphere underpins everything else. So without that, then the rest, won't exist and can't be supported. So that's the key thing to remember, which is why we're all looking at the changes that are going on in the Arctic and trying to better understand vegetation shifts and carbon stocks and all of these sorts of things. So we had a project together with ESA, in fact, who you've heard about in one of the previous talks, that was looking at Earth observation for SDGs. And so what you can see here is a global map where basically the map shows where nature contributes to the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals by mapping ecosystem services. So the value of water and forests and carbon and all these sorts of things. And most of this data and many of these patterns are derived from Earth observation data, such as land cover, which is then combined with other analytical tools. So without remote sensing, we would not be able to look at this and to do this analysis and to be able to understand the contribution of and where we're at in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. Some of the key recommendations that came out of this work, and so I think this is what's really important. I'll have a series of recommendations in the talk. And this again is about connecting science to policy. So the key things that came out were, one, to communicate and demonstrate the potential of Earth observation and remote sensing so that it can be fully exploited in indicator methodologies, as in developing indicators for policy. So use remote sensing. Second was to improve information flows to inform SDG related decision making. So that means having the communication between the scientists and the users be better so that understanding is improved and everyone is more on the same page. Similarly, or going on from that, the third one is about partnerships. So improve partnerships between government, between statistical offices and geospatial experts and scientists. And if those partnerships are improved, then communication will be improved, and then we'll maximize the use and uptake of remote sensing data into policy, and we'll be able to better understand things. So a lot of the remote sensing data comes from government, but there's also commercial image providers. So the fourth recommendation was that commercial image providers should be encouraged to work with countries on the provision of very high resolution Earth observations. And I think for a long time we've seen the benefit of that and of these private companies providing data, and how that also adds important information for all of us. The next example that I'll talk about is to do with forest significance and biodiversity intactness. So this is in biomes around the world. I'll draw your attention to the bottom right, to the little chart, where you can see there's biodiversity significance, which is increasing as you go up into the green area, the green little square. And then there's forest biodiversity intactness index, which as you go to the right, to the pink along the bottom, that increases. So the most valuable color is the deep red in the top right, where there's the highest biodiversity significance and the highest biodiversity intactness measure. So there you can see across the globe. It doesn't cover all of the Arctic, obviously. It does cover parts of it, and I think what is important to note here is you can see some of the boreal forest and how it's showing up as quite important, which echoes some of the earlier presentations today. This just zooms into Western Europe, so you can have a little bit more of a detailed view. So why does this matter? What can this tell us, or how can it be used? So we can basically gather statistics from regional or national levels that look at progress towards retaining biodiversity to where biodiversity is being damaged or destroyed. It enables us to advise land use planners, to also advise businesses about the consequences of development on biodiversity or on vegetation, where development would be most harmful, where it would be better to develop if it's necessary. We can advise protected area planners on hotspots of intactness or areas to consider preserving and protecting, and a whole host of applications. Next, we can look at forest loss and disturbance rather than sort of intactness and value. So I believe this was some of Matt Hansen's work was in other talks where he's tried to well, he has mapped, and he and his team have mapped global forest cover. And there's been assessments about the boreal forest as well, because as we've heard, it's really critical. And as the discussion we just had before my talk, talking about the Amazon versus Russia's forests. And so why is this important? So I just wanted to highlight a little section here where it says, with climate change and human impacts intensifying around the world, it is urgently important to be able to reliably distinguish temporary forest cover loss followed by naturally slow recovery from forest decline, requiring policy action. So just a nice example of where science is recognizing the policy importance and value of the research. Just another example of looking at forest disturbance. So there are studies looking at forest disturbance and the impact on vegetation regrowth using Landsat. And so why does this matter? Well, it's about recovery time. And as we've heard, with climate impacts, there might be more cases of disturbance, and they might be more frequent, or they might be larger. And so what are the implications on that? And how do we then respond from a policy point of view to look at areas that need protection, to look at areas that are undergoing the most profound changes, all that kind of thing, to see how biodiversity is shifting, how vegetation is shifting. And the fourth example is a project we've recently finished. It was part of the Horizon 2020 EU projects. It was called Ecopotential. So I've mentioned previously the Aichi biodiversity targets that were developed in 2010 and are finishing soon. So in the policy sphere, we hear a lot now about post-2020, post-2020 strategy, post-2020 targets. And so that's where we're currently at, and trying to develop the next suite of targets and of indicators so we can monitor biodiversity and vegetation and see where things are at. So this project was it was looking at protected areas around the world and working with protected area managers and staff to try to understand their understanding of Earth observation and of ecosystem services and how they applied it to their work, that we could better understand what was needed, what was being used, what was valuable. And so the key, I'll highlight some of the recommendations that came out of that. There's 5 key recommendations. And so these recommendations were presented to EU Parliament last year to a series of policymakers. So there was a really nice example, I think, of sitting there with the scientists and with the project managers and with the policymakers all trying to discuss this and explain. So the first recommendation was to expand the use of Earth observation to monitor and manage ecosystem services. So not just vegetation or landscapes, but actually ecosystem services. And as we've heard in other talks, things like carbon and the value of forests and water and all of that, that's really important. And this is essential for the economy and for society, so that makes it relatable. There's also the potential to incorporate remote sensing and in situ measurements, which I'll come to in a second. So the key here is to integrate Earth observation with policy development and policy achievement and success. And by being able to relate Earth observation to societal values, that will help. The second recommendation was to invest in the integration of remote sensing and in situ measurements. So these are complementary and some variables cannot be measured remotely alone. So integrate this, and again, it's a nice way to integrate on the ground knowledge, potentially in indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge, together with data, together with science. And there's some nice examples of where this occurs. For example, the LTER, the long-term ecological research activities, or the LifeWatch initiative through the European Union. The third recommendation was to incorporate remote sensing indicators in future environmental strategies. So really directly when policy is being developed, to keep in mind using remote sensing right off the bat to enable better indicators and targets to be written up. So remote sensing is known now, it's proven, it's reliable, and its value is only going to increase over time as there's more and more data and more and better analysis. It's cheap, it's simple, it's accurate, and importantly, it's comparable. So this sort of information should be integrated into targets and integrated into indicators in the future. And again, it can improve policy and enhance compliance and alignment with policy goals, because the science can better inform the policy if the policy is better informed by the science. The fourth recommendation is to support innovative ideas alongside proven mechanisms of impact. So, as I said in the previous one, remote sensing is established, but it's constantly growing. And as we've seen in the last 2 days as well, there's innovative techniques and analyses being done. There's so much potential for innovation. It's really important that government and policy also take that on board and that they can integrate technology in environmental management in order to be at the forefront and make the most progress. And the fifth thing I've mentioned before from the ESA project was to increase experience sharing and information flow and communication among stakeholders. So that's everyone from on-the-ground data collectors to scientists to policymakers, and consider a coordinated approach. So what this project showed was there was a real disparity on the use and understanding of Earth observation. Some protected area managers used it a lot and had a really high-level understanding. Maybe they were scientists before or had been just well informed, and others really didn't know the potential. So it's really important to join that up and also to consider access to data and access to science. And so to create communities of practice to enable remote sensing data to be better integrated across all levels and areas of expertise. And that will provide the most benefits for all. So those were a selection of some of the direct projects we've done. The next few are just some examples where I think there's a lot of potential, but we haven't necessarily had clear projects yet. So one of them is on forest biomass monitoring, which has been touched on a bit, and there's a whole lot of research on that as well. So measuring above ground biomass using remote sensing data and developing a forest observation system. And so why does this matter? Again, you can estimate, you can see changes over time and changes over space. You can use essential climate variables and essential biodiversity variables, and this in turn will support international policy. I think another really interesting one would be monitoring dewatering. So that is the sort of shifting landscape. So combining NDVI with normalized difference of wetness index potentially to look at things, and again, how the landscape is changing, how vegetation is changing, and how policy might respond to that. The last one I want to mention, I haven't talked much about the private sector, industry and business, and what their role in science and policy is. And I think the example below is likely from Africa or the Amazon, where it's looking at parcels of land and development across grids. But this is relevant for the Arctic as well. There's a lot of pressure in various Arctic regions for development, for mining, for oil, for gas development. So again, using remote sensing and Earth observation to look at the landscape, to look at the impacts, to map roads, to map sites of development, and be able to see the responses to that. And that will also enable policy to be much better informed and to respond better so that we can manage for the long term the environment, including in the Arctic. So the other thing I wanted to mention were mechanisms. So how do you connect science to policy? It's not always obvious, and it's certainly not obvious when you're sitting in a university necessarily. Sometimes if your funding comes from the government or from the EU, there's increasing, I guess, boxes that you need to tick and things you need to fulfill in order to make your research relevant. But it's still not always obvious how to do this and how to better connect. So there's one thing that is really worth mentioning, and it's called GeoBON. So Geo is the group on Earth observations, and BON is the Biodiversity Observation Network. So this is a global collaboration of more than 100 government organizations, NGOs, and individual scientists who are aiming to make biodiversity data, information, and forecasts accessible to policymakers, to managers, to other users and experts. And the aim is to integrate biological information with data, with forecasts on climate change, pollution, and all other threats like we've been talking about, and also to improve the communication between the groups. And this will lead to gap filling, will lead to better information, better understanding and requirements for the use of remote sensing data, and increasing the speed at which information is collected and disseminated. So there's a number of working groups within GeoBON, and one of them is Working Group 7, which is specifically on in situ and remote sensing data integration. So through GeoBON, there's been some interesting projects. For example, they've worked quite a lot on EBVs, or essential biodiversity variables, which we're starting to understand can increasingly be derived from satellite data and Earth observation. There's a lot of effort along that front. So for example, obviously I'm not going to go into the details on this slide, it's just really for the image. So there was a project through the University of Cambridge and us that looked at EBVs obtained from different types of LiDAR, and what you could do with that in order to sort of come up with a comprehensive monitoring system. And why does this matter? Well, again, so how can this sort of LiDAR develop EBVs, and how can this inform progress towards global goals and policy? So there was a clear policy connection through this work.
Yeah.
In this slide, I'm hoping this sort of summarizes some of what I've been talking about and the interactions of the process. So I'll just go through this. So in the very bottom, in the darkest blue circle, there you have in situ monitoring and remote sensing. So this is the data part of it, the collection of data that's all relevant. And then as you go up, following the first bottom arrow into the middle circle, essential biodiversity variables that I just talked about. These might be things to do with community composition. What are the species? Ecosystem structure, ecosystem function. And these are all things that are increasingly being able to be assessed by remote sensing. So then you have these EBVs, and from there you go into the biggest circle, the final one. And here's where all the sort of lots is happening up here. And this is where you develop indicators for biodiversity and ecosystem services. For example, for the CBD, which is the Convention on Biological Diversity, so the biodiversity policy aspect. And so all of this data then goes into EBVs, which is more like ecosystem and biodiversity understanding, and that then gets fed into the policy level to develop indicators. And at the very top, also scenarios. So by scenarios, this is where the modeling aspect comes into it. So you could look at 3 different outcomes, just like in climate scenarios, you have, you know, A, do nothing, B, what if this is the case, and C, what if we manage to make lots of changes and this is the case. So you can look at scenarios, and you can use remote sensing and modeling to look at these different future scenarios, and that in turn can better inform policy so that we can actually look to the future for what might happen if we don't do something, or if we do A versus if we do B. So hopefully that diagram sort of shows how this can all connect, and how data and science and knowledge can all connect into policy and policy processes. So the final couple of slides, just some considerations.
Finishing, yes, please.
Okay, just some considerations. So remote sensing for policy, it has to be driven by a need. It requires a chain that includes actions and response. So what do policymakers want? Do they want active alerts? Do they want to look when they want to look? It requires a clear technical implementation plan, and also a maintenance plan. And this also requires a budget, of course. So it does require careful planning and thinking. And what about enabling remote sensing in policy making and implementation? So products and data outputs have to be tailored to the user's technical ability and understanding, and they need support in their technical ability if they don't have it. So training and other support. And obviously this does require buy-in and political will, but I think that's where we see a lot of improvement. And what about the remote sensing and policy future? So increasingly there's platforms, data and metrics available. So combining all these elements into the policy chain is the biggest challenge. And that's what we really need to work on, but there's a lot of potential. And again, consider validation of data. Data have to be reliable if you can imagine the policy decision implications. So that's it. So hopefully that's given you some insight into how data and science connect to policy and why it all matters. And how science impacts policy and how policy impacts science. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Fiona. This is a really important aspect, turning our science results into policy. So I'm sure there will be 1 or 2 questions about this. Коллеги, есть ли у кого-то вопросы? Это действительно животрепещущая тема, когда мы наши научные результаты...
Alex, does anyone have any questions? Because this is a very important topic of converting scientific findings into political actions.
Well, I have a short question, because this is a really, really hot topic for Russia, because we have a lot of wonderful science, but it's not always turned into policy. As Sergey shown today in his slide, well, statistical estimates, official statistical estimates and remote sensing results really differ sometimes for forests. What are the most successful countries, from your point of view, in implementing remote sensing into policy meaningfully?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure I don't think I can answer for the globe. I can certainly give a couple of good examples. I think, I'm not sure about currently necessarily, but Brazil has been really good at including remote sensing, obviously with all the forest changes, and at being sort of some of the, one of the first to really do almost live monitoring, so you can really see illegal logging and those sorts of efforts, and that is incorporated quite well into government policies. I think that has been a good example. Other cases, I think I would say that just as a whole, it's been improving in Europe, I suppose, and I think the European Space Agency, together with the EU, has put in a lot of effort to improve this and to increase this, and obviously the Copernicus program has made a really big difference, so that's kind of a broad example. And then I suppose the other thing to consider beyond countries are just things that make it possible. So just the advancing. So, you know, I guess NASA's put in a lot of efforts. There's things like Google Earth Engine. So there's a lot of things like that that are enabling it to be better across the board. Hopefully that answers some. I'm sure there's other good examples, but there's a couple at least.
Yes, thank you. Коллеги, есть ли еще вопросы к Фионе сейчас?
Colleagues, do we have any other questions to Fiona?
Can I add one thing? A second
Yes.
answer to your question, Olga, that's also really important to consider is people and personnel change. So scientists are often quite consistent. You know, we do our jobs and we work as scientists probably for most of our career. But that's not the same for policymakers. And this is often the challenge that we have, is that you might have a connection, you might know the Minister of Environment, you might know his team, they might be really keen to work with you. But all of a sudden the government changes and that person is gone and you've lost that connection. So I think that's an important component of your question, which is why the examples may well change as well. Again, if you don't establish these protocols and processes, like I said in my last few slides.
Yes, like you shown, a very successful example is when you have government scientists working with independent scientists, and then those government scientists bring things to policymakers, and they're ready to listen.
Можно мне прокомментировать немножко?
Yeah, Sergey.
May I offer a comment? I believe that Russia is one of the most successful countries in terms of converting the remote sense data into political action. Not all remote sense data becomes policy, but some data manages to do it and does it successfully. Since 2005, we have been remotely monitoring the wildfires, the forest fires. And on the basis of this system, every day decisions are taken, all kinds of decisions, operational decisions, political decisions. In 2012, President Putin made a decision to replace the Minister of Forestry on the basis of remotely sensed data. So we have excellent cases of turning RS into politics, policy and politics too. So Russia is one of the successful cases. Thanks.